Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what I am about to show you contradicts every official statement made by the Treasury Department in the past 14 months. What we are witnessing is not sanctions pressure forcing Iranian compliance. It is not maximum pressure crippling the Iranian economy. What we are witnessing is Iranian oil revenue reaching levels not seen since 2018, and the mechanisms that made this possible were created directly by American sanctions policy. I am looking at shipping data compiled by Capeler, Vortexa, and Tanker Trackers covering the period from January 2025 through March 2026. What this data shows is not declining Iranian oil exports. What this data shows is 6 million barrels per day of Iranian crude and condensate exports in March 2026 compared to 4 million barrels per day in March 2025. That is an 85% increase in export volume in 12 months during a period when sanctions were supposedly being enforced with maximum rigor. In the next 21 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly how this happened, why American policy created the conditions for Iranian revenue growth rather than preventing it, and why the consequences of this miscalculation extend far beyond oil markets into the structure of global financial systems. This is Daily Brief. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being systematically ignored by officials who designed these policies and who have every incentive to pretend they are working. Let's start with the theory behind sanctions, because understanding why this policy failed requires understanding what it was supposed to accomplish. The goal was simple: cut off Iranian access to international banking systems, making it impossible for Iran to receive payment for oil exports. Threaten secondary sanctions against any company or financial institution that processes Iranian transactions. Intimidate shipowners, insurers, and refiners into refusing to handle Iranian crude. Collapse Iranian oil exports from 8 million barrels per day to near zero. Force Iranian government to choose between economic collapse or capitulation to American demands. That was the theory. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated in February 2025 that Iran would face, quote, the most severe sanctions regime ever imposed on any nation, and that Iranian oil exports would be reduced to, quote, the lowest levels in history within 6 months. That was February 2025. It is now April 2026. Iranian oil exports are not at the lowest levels in history. They are at the highest levels since 2018, before the first round of Trump administration sanctions were fully implemented. What happened? According to detailed analysis by S&P Global Platts and Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy, the answer is that sanctions created a shadow market, and that shadow market is more profitable for Iran than the legitimate market ever was. Let me explain exactly how this works, because the mechanics are crucial. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing that the headlines about Iranian economic collapse do not match the actual export data. Now let's talk about the shadow fleet, because that is where this entire system begins. Announcement number 1, the dark fleet. And this one matters more than anything else because it represents the infrastructure that makes sanctions evasion not just possible, but systematic and scalable. A dark fleet vessel is a tanker that operates outside normal commercial shipping frameworks. It disables its automatic identification system transponder, making it invisible to satellite tracking. It uses shell companies registered in jurisdictions with weak regulatory oversight to obscure ownership. It obtains insurance through non-Western providers or operates without insurance entirely, accepting the risk. And it conducts ship-to-ship transfers in international waters to further obscure the origin of the cargo. According to research by United Against Nuclear Iran, a hawkish advocacy organization that has every reason to inflate the effectiveness of sanctions, Iran currently operates or has access to approximately 350 vessels in its dark fleet. That number has grown from roughly 90 vessels in early 2023 to 350 in early 2026. The fleet has quadrupled in size in 3 years. Lloyd's List Intelligence, which tracks global shipping, estimates that dark fleet vessels moved approximately 850,000 barrels per day of Iranian crude in March 2026. That is 33% of total Iranian exports moving on ships that are specifically designed to evade detection and sanctions enforcement. Those ships are not new construction. They are old tankers, typically 15 to 25 years old, purchased at scrap prices by front companies and operated with minimal maintenance until they are no longer seaworthy. The environmental risk is considerable. These vessels do not meet modern safety standards, and a spill from one of them would be catastrophic. But from Iran's perspective, that risk is acceptable because the alternative is zero exports. From China's perspective, that risk is acceptable because discounted Iranian crude reduces its energy costs. And from the ship operator's perspective, the profit margins are extraordinary because they charge premium rates for taking on the sanctions risk. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2. China is not just buying Iranian oil, China is paying more for it than official statements acknowledge. This is the part that Treasury Department briefings systematically misrepresent. The public narrative is that Iranian oil sells at massive discounts, sometimes $25 to $30 per barrel below market price, and that these discounts represent economic pain for Iran. That narrative is partially true, but deeply misleading. Yes, Iranian crude sells at a discount to Brent crude prices. According to data from Argus Media and Platts, Iranian crude sold to Chinese refiners at an average discount of $14 per barrel in the first quarter of 2026, when Brent was averaging $86 per barrel. That means Iranian crude was selling for approximately $72 per barrel. But here is what the official narrative does not tell you. Iranian production costs for crude extraction are among the lowest in the world, averaging between $8 and $12 per barrel, according to Rystad Energy Analysis. That means even at $72 per barrel, Iran is generating profit margins of $60 per barrel. With exports running at 6 million barrels per day, that translates to $156 million in daily revenue, or approximately $68 billion per month. Stay with me, because this is where the math reveals the scale of the policy failure. Iran's total government budget for fiscal year 2025-2026 was approximately $510 billion, according to Iranian parliamentary records. Oil revenue at current export volumes and prices generates roughly $56 billion annually. That is 11% of the total budget. That percentage is significant, but not economically crippling, especially because Iran has diversified its revenue sources over the past decade. Non-oil exports, primarily petrochemicals, agriculture, and manufactured goods, generated approximately $48 billion in 2025, according to Iranian customs data. The government also raises revenue through domestic taxation, state-owned enterprise profits, and what Western analysts politely call extra budgetary funds managed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The key point is this: sanctions have not collapsed Iranian government revenue. Sanctions have shifted Iranian revenue streams away from transparent, dollar-denominated transactions toward opaque, yuan-denominated transactions that benefit China and reduce American financial surveillance capabilities. That is not success. That is our own goal of staggering proportions. Announcement number 3. The yuan is displacing the dollar in energy markets, and American sanctions accelerated this process. This one, almost nobody in mainstream American media is connecting correctly. When the United States threatens secondary sanctions against banks that process Iranian transactions, those banks have 2 options. Option 1, comply with American demands, refuse to handle Iranian payments, and lose access to a growing segment of global energy trade. Option 2, develop payment mechanisms that bypass the dollar and the American financial system entirely. China chose option 2. According to analysis by the Atlantic Council, and confirmed by Chinese customs data that researchers at the Carnegie Endowment cross-referenced, approximately 95% of Iranian oil sales to China in 2025 were settled in yuan, not dollars. That represents roughly $100 billion in annual trade that is now conducted outside the dollar system. Think carefully about what this represents. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency is not based on affection for America or ideological alignment. It is based on the fact that the largest and most liquid markets, including energy markets, are denominated in dollars. When oil transactions shift to yuan, the network effects that sustain dollar dominance erode incrementally but cumulatively. The People's Bank of China reported in February 2026 that yuan-denominated trade settlement increased by 34% in 2025 compared to 2024. The largest single driver of that increase was energy imports from Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, 3 countries under American sanctions that have shifted to yuan pricing specifically to avoid dollar-based enforcement mechanisms. BlackRock's global allocation team published a research note in March 2026 stating that, quote, "De-dollarization is no longer a hypothetical future risk. It is a present reality in commodity markets, and the trend is accelerating." When the largest asset manager in the world issues that assessment, it is not speculation. It is observable market behavior. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the official narrative, because there are two stories and only one of them is true. The official story is that sanctions are working, that Iran is economically isolated, and that maximum pressure will eventually force Iranian capitulation. That story is repeated in Treasury Department press releases, State Department briefings, and congressional testimony. But the data tells a different story. Iranian oil exports increased 85% year over year. Iranian government revenue from oil sales increased proportionally. Iran's non-oil exports grew by 12% in 2025, according to the International Monetary Fund. The Iranian rial, after depreciating significantly in mid-2025, stabilized and actually appreciated by 8% against the dollar in the first quarter of 2026, after Iran implemented capital controls and expanded yuan reserves. If sanctions were working, those indicators would be moving in the opposite direction. They are not. Which means either the sanctions are not being enforced, or they are being enforced, but Iranian adaptation has rendered them ineffective. The evidence strongly suggests the latter. If you are an American taxpayer, your government is spending billions of dollars annually on sanctions enforcement mechanisms, Treasury Department sanctions offices, satellite surveillance of shipping, diplomatic pressure on allies to comply with secondary sanctions, and the opportunity cost of alienated trading partners. That money is not achieving its stated objectives. If you are a Chinese refiner, you are purchasing discounted crude that reduces your input costs and makes your refined products more competitive globally, including in competition with American refineries. If you are an Iranian oil official, you are generating revenue that funds government operations and regional activities that American policy is specifically designed to prevent. And if you are watching the dollar's share of global currency reserves decline from 71% in 1999 to 58% in 2024, according to the IMF, you are watching American financial leverage erode in real time. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and the outcome is always the same. The Napoleonic Wars. Britain imposed a naval blockade called the Continental System, designed to strangle French trade and collapse Napoleon's economy. France responded by developing overland trade routes through Central Europe and Russia. The blockade did impose costs on France, certainly, but it also imposed costs on Britain, alienated British trading partners, and pushed continental European economies toward greater integration with France rather than greater dependence on Britain. The blockade did not defeat Napoleon. Russian winter and the coalition armies defeated Napoleon. The blockade was a costly strategic failure that demonstrated the limits of economic coercion against a determined adversary with access to alternative markets. Right now, the United States is imposing a financial blockade designed to strangle Iranian trade. Iran is responding by developing alternative payment systems and trade routes through China, Russia, and Central Asia. The blockade is imposing costs on Iran, certainly, but it is also imposing costs on the United States, alienating American trading partners who resent secondary sanctions and pushing global commodity markets toward greater integration with yuan-denominated systems rather than greater dependence on the dollar. So where does this leave us? Let me give you three scenarios, because the policy options from this point are constrained by the failures already accumulated. Path 1. Escalation. The United States expands secondary sanctions to include Chinese state-owned banks that process Iranian transactions. China retaliates with sanctions on American technology companies and agricultural exports. The result is a trade war that damages both economies, accelerates de-dollarization, and does not meaningfully reduce Iranian oil exports because China is willing to absorb the costs to secure discounted energy. Likelihood assessment, 25%. Path 2. Negotiated off-ramp. The United States offers sanctions relief in exchange for Iranian concessions on nuclear program restrictions and regional behavior modifications. Iran agrees to limited restrictions in exchange for access to frozen assets and partial sanctions relief. Oil exports increase further as legitimate buyers re-enter the market. This path requires both sides to claim victory while accepting compromises. Likelihood assessment, 40%. Path 3. Status quo failure. The United States maintains sanctions but does not meaningfully escalate enforcement. Iran continues exporting 2 to 3 million barrels per day through the shadow fleet. China continues paying in yuan. The dollar's share of global transactions continues declining. American officials continue claiming success while the data shows otherwise. Likelihood assessment, 35%. I think we are currently in path 3 and likely to remain there because escalation risks a broader economic conflict that neither Washington nor Beijing wants, and negotiation requires admitting that sanctions failed, which is politically unacceptable for the current administration. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, when a sanctions policy increases the target's revenue rather than decreasing it, at what point do we acknowledge the policy failed? Second, if sanctions are pushing global energy markets away from dollar pricing and toward yuan pricing, who is actually being damaged more, Iran or the United States? Third, if China is willing to absorb the risks of sanctions evasion to secure discounted energy, what leverage does the United States actually have to change that calculation? Tell me in the comments whether you think I am reading this data correctly, or if there are factors I am missing. Tell me if you believe the administration will shift course or continue insisting that the policy is working despite evidence to the contrary. We will keep tracking Iranian oil exports, yuan-denominated trade flows, and the broader implications for dollar dominance. That is what Daily Brief does every single day. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone who wants to understand the gap between official statements and observable reality. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update, and we will see you in the next briefing.